The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Clarence House as King Charles III sat in his private study, staring at the ornate invitation that had arrived with the Morning Post. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he read the elegant script announcing the upcoming wedding of Camilla's niece, Sarah Parker Bowles, to a prominent London businessman. The invitation was formal, traditional, and exactly the kind of family celebration that would normally warrant royal attendance. Charles set the invitation down on his mahogany desk and rubbed his temples. The weight of recent events pressed heavily on his shoulders, and this seemingly innocent piece of correspondence represented far more than a simple family gathering. It was a test, a challenge, and, perhaps most importantly, a decision that would define his reign and his relationship with the woman he had loved for decades. The previous months had been tumultuous for the newly crowned monarch. Since ascending to the throne following his mother's passing, Charles had faced unprecedented challenges in modernizing the monarchy while maintaining its centuries-old traditions. Public opinion polls showed mixed feelings about his reign, with many questioning whether he possessed the same steadfast dedication that had characterized Queen Elizabeth II's remarkable tenure. But it wasn't the public scrutiny that kept Charles awake at night. It was the growing tension within his own household, specifically concerning Camilla's extensive family and their increasingly bold attempts to establish themselves within royal circles. What had begun as occasional requests for royal patronage had evolved into a systematic campaign to elevate the Parker Bowles name to unprecedented heights within British society. The trouble had started subtly, almost imperceptibly. Shortly after Charles's coronation, Camilla's brother, Mark Shand, had approached the palace with a proposal to establish a new charitable foundation bearing the royal seal. While charitable work was certainly within the royal family's purview, the proposal lacked the careful vetting and strategic planning that typically characterized royal endorsements. When the palace's private secretaries politely declined the immediate approval, citing the need for proper evaluation, Mark had responded with surprising anger. He had publicly suggested that the royal family was being unnecessarily cautious and that they should trust Camilla's judgment regarding her own family's initiatives. The incident had created an uncomfortable rift that Charles had hoped would heal with time. However, the situation had only escalated. Camilla's children from her previous marriage, Tom and Laura, had begun making appearances at high-profile events, often photographed alongside minor royals, and presenting themselves as integral members of the royal family. While Charles harbored no ill will toward his stepchildren, their increasingly prominent presence was creating confusion about the line of succession and the official hierarchy within the monarchy. The breaking point had come during a state dinner honoring the Prime Minister of Canada. Camilla's cousin, Derek Parker Bowles, had somehow secured an invitation through channels that bypassed the usual protocol. During the evening, Derek had cornered several foreign diplomats, introducing himself as a close advisor to the king and offering his services as an unofficial liaison for business interests seeking royal endorsement. Charles had learned of Derek's behavior through his equerry, who had received concerned inquiries from the Canadian delegation about the appropriateness of Derek's representations. The king had been mortified, realizing that his family's reputation and the integrity of the monarchy itself were being compromised by individuals who felt entitled to trade on their connection to the crown. The investigation that followed revealed a disturbing pattern. Multiple members of Camilla's extended family had been leveraging their royal connections for personal and financial gain. There were instances of relatives accepting paid speaking engagements where they discussed life inside the royal family, despite having limited actual access to palace operations. Others had established consulting businesses that prominently featured their royal connections in marketing materials. Most troubling of all was the discovery that several family members had been sharing private information about royal schedules and personal preferences with media outlets and commercial interests. While none of the revelations rose to the level of serious security breaches, they represented a fundamental violation of the trust and discretion that the royal family demanded from those in their inner circle. Charles had always prided himself on being a patient and understanding man, qualities that had served him well during his long wait to become king. However, the accumulation of these incidents had forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. His love for Camilla was being exploited by individuals who viewed their connection to her as a pathway to wealth, influence, and social status. The king's inner circle, including his most trusted advisors and longtime friends, had begun expressing their concerns more openly. They worried that the monarchy's reputation for dignity and discretion was being eroded by the constant stream of controversies surrounding Camilla's relatives. Some had suggested that decisive action was necessary to preserve the institution's integrity. As Charles contemplated the wedding invitation, he realized that his attendance would be interpreted as an endorsement of the very behavior he found so troubling. The event would inevitably become a media spectacle, with Camilla's family members using the royal presence to further elevate their own profiles. Photographers would capture images of the king socializing with individuals who had repeatedly demonstrated their willingness to exploit their royal connections. Yet the alternative was equally fraught with consequences. Declining to attend would represent an unprecedented public rejection of his wife's family, a move that would certainly become front-page news and potentially damage his relationship with Camilla herself. The queen consort had always maintained that her family's actions were well-intentioned, even if occasionally misguided, and she had repeatedly asked Charles to show patience and understanding. The study's telephone rang, interrupting Charles's contemplation. His private secretary informed him that Camilla was requesting a meeting to discuss the wedding invitation. The king agreed to see her immediately, knowing that the conversation would be difficult but necessary. As he waited for his wife to arrive, Charles reflected on the irony of his situation. He had spent decades fighting for the right to marry the woman he loved, enduring public criticism and family disapproval. Now, having finally achieved that goal and assumed the throne, he found himself in the impossible position of having to choose between his duty as king and his loyalty to his wife's family. Camilla entered the study with measured steps, her expression carefully composed despite the tension that had been building between them for weeks. She wore a simple navy dress that Charles recognized as one of her favorites, and her silver hair was styled in the understated elegance that had become her signature as queen consort. However, her usually warm blue eyes carried a hint of apprehension as she settled into the leather chair across from her husband's desk. "I assume you've seen the invitation," she began, her voice steady but lacking its usual warmth. The years had taught her to read Charles's moods with remarkable accuracy, and she could see the storm clouds gathering behind his carefully maintained royal composure. Charles nodded slowly, picking up the cream-colored card and studying it once more. "Sarah's wedding should be a joyous occasion," he said carefully, choosing his words with the precision that decades of public life had ingrained in him. "I'm sure she'll make a beautiful bride." Camilla's posture stiffened slightly at his diplomatic tone. After so many years together, she could recognize when he was retreating into his formal royal persona, a defense mechanism he employed when difficult conversations were imminent. "But you're not planning to attend," she said, her statement carrying the weight of certainty rather than inquiry. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably between them, filled with the unspoken tensions that had been accumulating like storm clouds on the horizon. Through the tall windows, they could see the palace staff going about their morning routines, maintaining the seamless operations that kept the monarchy functioning while the personal dramas of its principals played out behind closed doors. "Camilla," Charles began, then paused, struggling to find the right words. "We need to discuss what's been happening with your family. The incidents have become impossible to ignore." Her face flushed slightly, a reaction that Charles had rarely seen during their long relationship. Camilla had always prided herself on her composure and her ability to handle difficult situations with grace, qualities that had made her an effective queen consort despite the challenging circumstances of her entry into the royal family. "They're not perfect," she admitted, her voice carrying a defensive edge. "But they're my family, Charles. They've supported me through some of the most difficult periods of my life. When the entire world seemed to hate me, when I was receiving death threats and couldn't leave my house without security, they stood by me." Charles felt a familiar pang of guilt at her words. He remembered those dark years when their relationship had made Camilla one of the most vilified women in Britain. The press had portrayed her as the woman who destroyed a fairy tale marriage, conveniently ignoring the complex realities of his relationship with Diana and the arranged nature of royal matrimony. "I understand their loyalty to you," he said gently, "and I respect what you've all been through together. But their recent behavior is putting the monarchy at risk. The business with Derek at the state dinner was deeply embarrassing. We had foreign dignitaries questioning the integrity of our institutions because he was presenting himself as speaking for the crown." Camilla's hands tightened in her lap, her knuckles showing white beneath her well-maintained skin. "Derek made a mistake," she conceded. "But he was trying to be helpful. He thought he was representing our interests." "That's precisely the problem," Charles replied, his voice taking on the firm tone he used when addressing matters of state. He thought he had the authority to represent the crown's interests. Your family members seem to believe that their connection to you grants them some sort of official status within the royal hierarchy. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Charles's equerry entered with a silver tray bearing their traditional morning tea service, a routine that had continued unchanged despite the gravity of their discussion. The momentary pause allowed both of them to collect their thoughts and consider their next words carefully. As the equerry withdrew and closed the door behind him, Camilla poured tea with movements that spoke of years of practice in royal protocols. The familiar ritual seemed to calm her slightly, and when she spoke again, her voice had regained some of its usual steadiness. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, meeting his gaze directly. "That I cut ties with my family? That I pretend they don't exist because they don't meet the royal family's standards of perfection?" Charles set down his teacup with careful precision. "I'm not asking you to cut ties with anyone, but I am asking you to help me establish clear boundaries about what is and isn't acceptable behavior for those connected to the royal family. And if I refuse?" The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. "Then I'll have to establish those boundaries myself," Charles replied, the weight of his position as monarch evident in his tone. "The institution comes first, Camilla. It has to. That's what I swore to protect when I was crowned. And it's what the people of this realm expect from their king." The words hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge. Camilla had always understood intellectually that Charles's duty to the crown would sometimes conflict with their personal relationship, but this was the first time she had felt the full weight of that reality pressing down upon her. "So the wedding," she said quietly. "The wedding will become a circus if I attend," Charles explained, his voice softening with genuine regret. "Every photographer in London will be there, documenting every interaction between me and your family members. Any conversation, any gesture of friendliness, will be interpreted as royal approval of their previous actions." Camilla stood abruptly and walked to the window, her silhouette framed against the morning light. For a moment, she looked every one of her 76 years, the weight of her position and the impossible choices it demanded visible in the set of her shoulders. "I never wanted this to happen," she said without turning around. "I never wanted to be the queen who couldn't protect her own family from royal politics." Charles rose from his desk and approached her, stopping just short of physical contact. He wanted to comfort her, to take her in his arms as he had done countless times over the decades of their relationship, but the formal nature of their discussion seemed to create an invisible barrier between them. "This isn't about protection," he said quietly. "It's about accountability. Your family's actions have consequences that extend far beyond their personal lives. They're affecting the reputation of the monarchy, and, by extension, they're affecting our ability to serve the British people effectively." When Camilla finally turned to face him, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, though her voice remained controlled. "And what about my ability to serve as your wife? What about our marriage, Charles? Does that matter less than the institution?" The question struck at the heart of Charles's deepest fears. He had waited so long to marry Camilla, had endured so much criticism and personal sacrifice to make their union possible. The thought of their relationship becoming another casualty of royal duty was almost unbearable. The palace walls seemed to close in around Charles as he struggled with Camilla's question. The weight of his crown, both literal and metaphorical, had never felt heavier than in this moment of personal crisis. He found himself remembering his mother's words from years ago, when she had spoken about the sacrifices required of those who serve the monarchy. "Our marriage matters more to me than anything," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But if we allow your family's behavior to continue unchecked, it won't matter how much we love each other. The damage to the crown will eventually destroy everything we've built together." Camilla moved away from the window and sat down heavily in her chair, the fight seeming to drain out of her. She had always known that marrying into the royal family would require sacrifices, but she had never anticipated being forced to choose between her husband's position and her family's well-being. "What if I speak with them?" she offered, her voice taking on a pleading quality that Charles had rarely heard. "What if I make it clear that their behavior needs to change? Surely we can find a way to resolve this without such drastic measures." Charles returned to his desk, but remained standing, his hands gripping the back of his chair. "We've tried that approach, darling. Remember the conversation we had with Tom and Laura about their public appearances? They agreed to be more discreet, and Yet last month Laura was photographed at a charity gala introducing herself as the Queen Consort's daughter to potential donors. The memory clearly pained Camilla, and she closed her eyes briefly before responding. She's proud of our relationship. Is that such a terrible thing? It's not about pride, Charles explained patiently. It's about the systematic exploitation of royal connections for personal gain. Your family members aren't simply expressing pride in their relationship with you. They're monetizing it, and that crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Charles's secure phone ringing. He glanced at the caller identification and saw that it was his private secretary with what was undoubtedly an urgent matter requiring his immediate attention. With an apologetic look toward Camilla, he answered the call. Your Majesty. His secretary's voice was carefully controlled, but Charles could detect underlying tension. I'm afraid we have another situation developing. The Daily Mail has published an article this morning about Mr. Derek Parker Bowles's business activities. They're suggesting that he's been using letterhead that implies royal endorsement for his consulting firm. Charles felt his jaw tighten as he listened to the details. Derek had apparently been sending promotional materials to potential clients that featured a photograph of himself with Camilla at a family gathering, along with text that heavily implied official royal support for his business ventures. How widespread is the distribution? Charles asked. We're still investigating, but it appears that several international clients have received these materials. The Foreign Office has received inquiries from 3 different embassies asking about the authenticity of Mr. Parker Bowles's claims regarding royal endorsement. Charles closed his eyes and took a deep breath before responding. Prepare a statement clarifying that Mr. Parker Bowles has no official role within the royal household and that his business activities do not carry royal endorsement. Have it ready for my review within the hour. After ending the call, Charles looked across at Camilla, who had clearly overheard enough of the conversation to understand its implications. Her face had gone pale, and her hands were trembling slightly as she reached for her teacup. Derek? She asked, though she already knew the answer. He's been using photographs from family gatherings to suggest royal endorsement of his business, Charles confirmed, his voice heavy with disappointment. We now have foreign governments questioning the integrity of our commercial relationships because of his deception. Camilla set down her teacup with shaking hands. I had no idea. Charles, you have to believe me. I would never have allowed such a thing if I had known. I do believe you, he said gently, moving around his desk to sit in the chair beside her. But that's exactly why this situation has become so problematic. Your family members are taking actions that reflect on the crown without any oversight or accountability. They're making decisions that affect international relations and public trust without considering the consequences. The weight of realization was settling over Camilla like a heavy blanket. She had spent years defending her family's actions as innocent mistakes or misunderstandings, but the pattern of behavior was becoming impossible to ignore. Each incident built upon the previous ones, creating a mounting case against the Parker Bowles family's fitness to be associated with the royal household. What happens now? She asked, her voice small and defeated. Charles took her hands in his, feeling the familiar comfort of their physical connection even in the midst of this crisis. Now we have to make the difficult choice between protecting your family and protecting the monarchy. I can't continue to allow their actions to undermine the institution that I've sworn to serve. You're really going to reject them, she said, the finality of the situation becoming clear. You're going to cut them off from royal events, from royal access, from everything that connects them to this life. I'm going to establish boundaries that should have been in place from the beginning, Charles corrected. Your immediate family, your children, will always be welcome in our personal lives. But the extended family members who have repeatedly demonstrated their inability to respect royal protocols will no longer have access to official events or royal venues. Camilla pulled her hands free and stood up abruptly, pacing to the fireplace where portraits of previous monarchs gazed down at them with stern expressions. Do you understand what you're asking of me? These people supported me when the entire country wanted me to disappear. They stood by me when I was the most hated woman in Britain. And now you want me to abandon them because they're not sophisticated enough to navigate royal protocol. I'm not asking you to abandon anyone, Charles replied, rising to follow her. I'm asking you to help me protect the institution that we're both sworn to serve. The monarchy is bigger than any individual, Camilla. It's bigger than both of us. She turned to face him, and for the first time in their long relationship, he saw something approaching anger in her eyes. Don't lecture me about service to the crown, Charles. I've given up everything for this institution. I've endured decades of public humiliation, death threats, and character assassination. I've played the part of the dutiful royal wife while watching my family be treated like embarrassing relatives who should be hidden away. The passion in her voice was something Charles had rarely witnessed, and it caught him off guard. Camilla had always been remarkably composed in the face of criticism, accepting the challenges of royal life with grace and dignity. To see her finally expressing the resentment and hurt that she had clearly been carrying was both enlightening and heartbreaking. "You're right," he admitted, his own voice thick with emotion. "You have sacrificed enormously for this institution and for our marriage. But I'm asking you to make one more sacrifice, perhaps the most difficult one of all." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of London traffic and the measured footsteps of palace guards making their rounds. Both Charles and Camilla seemed to understand that they had reached a crucial juncture, not just in their current disagreement, but in their relationship as a whole. The news of King Charles's decision spread through the palace like wildfire, though the official announcement wouldn't come until later that afternoon. Staff members who had served the royal family for decades found themselves witnessing an unprecedented moment in royal history. Never before had a reigning monarch taken such decisive action against his consort's family while maintaining the marriage itself. In the queen consort's private apartments, Camilla sat surrounded by her closest ladies-in-waiting, all of whom wore expressions of shock and concern. The women had become not just her staff, but her trusted confidants, and they understood better than anyone the emotional toll this decision was taking on their employer. Lady Susan Hussey, who had served the royal family for over 60 years, was the first to break the uncomfortable silence. "Ma'am, perhaps there's still time to find a compromise. His Majesty has always been a reasonable man, and your happiness has always been important to him." Camilla looked up from the letter she had been drafting to her brother Mark, explaining the situation before he heard it from other sources. Her face was composed, but those who knew her well could see the strain around her eyes. "There is no compromise, Susan," she said quietly. "Charles has made his position clear. The monarchy comes first, and my family's behavior has become incompatible with royal standards." Meanwhile, in the king's study, Charles was meeting with his most senior advisors to discuss the implementation of his decision. The palace's communications secretary, the private secretary, and the master of the household sat around the polished conference table, their faces grave as they considered the unprecedented nature of the situation. "Your Majesty," the communications secretary began carefully, "we need to consider how this decision will be perceived by the public and the media. The narrative could easily become one of the king rejecting his wife's family out of snobbery or elitism." Charles nodded, having anticipated this concern. "That's why the statement must focus on the specific behavioral issues rather than making general judgments about the Parker Bowles family. We need to be clear that this is about accountability and standards, not about social class or personal preferences." The private secretary leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Might I suggest that we prepare a detailed briefing document for senior media figures? If we can provide specific examples of the problematic behavior, it will be harder for critics to paint this as arbitrary or unfair." "Absolutely not," Charles replied firmly. "I will not engage in a public character assassination of my wife's relatives. The statement will be dignified and focused on the future rather than relitigating past incidents." As the afternoon wore on, word of the impending announcement began to leak beyond palace walls. Political journalists and royal correspondents started making urgent phone calls to their sources, trying to confirm the rumors that were spreading through London's media circles. The story was too significant to ignore, and the potential implications for the monarchy were enormous. At her home in Wiltshire, Derek Parker Bowles was completely unaware of the storm that was about to engulf him. He was in his study, working on marketing materials for his consulting business, when his phone rang with a call from a journalist at the Times. "Mr. Parker Bowles, we understand that Buckingham Palace is preparing to issue a statement regarding your business activities. Do you have any comment?" Derek's face went white as the journalist explained what they had learned about the king's decision. The implications hit him like a physical blow, and he struggled to maintain his composure as he ended the call without providing a statement. Back at the palace, Camilla had finished writing her letters to various family members and was now facing the most difficult call of all. She dialed her son Tom's number, knowing that she needed to explain the situation to her children before they heard it from other sources. "Mom," Tom's voice carried immediate concern when he heard the strain in her greeting. "Tom, darling, I need to tell you something important before it becomes public," Camilla began, her voice carefully controlled. Your stepfather has made a decision about the family's involvement in royal events. As she explained the situation, she could hear the shock and anger building in Tom's voice. By the time she finished, he was practically shouting into the phone. This is outrageous. After everything our family has been through, after all the support we've given you, he's just going to cast us aside like we're some sort of embarrassment. It's not that simple, Tom. Camilla tried to explain, though she could hear the pain in her own voice. There have been issues with some family members that have created problems for the monarchy. What issues? Uncle Derek's business? That's hardly a capital crime. Camilla closed her eyes, knowing that her son's perspective was colored by family loyalty and his inability to see how royal protocols differed from normal family relationships. The monarchy operates under different rules, darling. Actions that might be acceptable in private life become problematic when they're connected to the crown. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Tom alternating between anger at Charles and concern for his mother's well-being. By the time Camilla ended the call, she felt emotionally drained and more isolated than she had in years. The official statement was released at 4 o'clock that afternoon, carefully worded to minimize damage while making the king's position clear. His Majesty the King has decided that certain members of the Queen Consort's extended family will no longer participate in official royal events or represent themselves as having formal connections to the royal household. This decision reflects the Crown's commitment to maintaining the highest standards of conduct and ensuring that all associations with the monarchy uphold the dignity and integrity of the institution. The King and Queen Consort remain fully committed to their roles and to each other. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Within minutes, the palace phone lines were jammed with calls from journalists around the world. Social media erupted with commentary ranging from support for the king's decisive leadership to criticism of what some saw as cold-hearted treatment of the Queen Consort's family. Royal commentators began appearing on television news programs, offering their analysis of the unprecedented situation. Some praised Charles for putting duty before personal relationships, comparing his action to difficult decisions made by previous monarchs in the name of institutional integrity. Others questioned whether the king was being too harsh and suggested that the move might damage his relationship with Camilla irreparably. As evening approached, Charles and Camilla found themselves alone in their private sitting room, the weight of the day's events hanging heavily between them. Neither had spoken much since the statement's release, both lost in their own thoughts about what the future might hold. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, Camilla finally broke the silence. About marriage requiring sacrifice and compromise. Charles looked up from the briefing papers he had been reviewing, giving her his full attention. I understand why you made this decision, she continued, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. I don't agree with it, and I think it's going to cause tremendous pain for people I love. But I understand that you felt you had no choice. I didn't want it to come to this, Charles replied softly. I've been hoping for months that we could find another way. I know, she said, moving to sit beside him on the sofa. And I know that this decision hurt you as much as it hurt me. That's what makes it so difficult to argue against. They sat in silence for a few more minutes, the comfortable familiarity of their long relationship providing some comfort despite the upheaval of the day. Outside their windows, London continued its evening routines, unaware that inside the palace, a king and queen were grappling with one of the most challenging decisions of their reign. 3 months had passed since the palace announcement, and the initial media storm had gradually subsided into occasional commentary pieces and royal family documentaries that revisited the unprecedented decision. The king's approval ratings, which had initially dipped following the announcement, had begun to recover as the public came to understand the reasoning behind his choice. Charles sat in his private study on a crisp January morning, reviewing correspondence from Commonwealth leaders who had expressed their support for his handling of the situation. Several had privately confided that they had faced similar challenges with family members who sought to capitalize on their political positions, and they respected his commitment to institutional integrity. The morning routine at Clarence House had settled into a new normal, though the absence of certain family members at recent events had been notable. The Christmas celebrations had been particularly challenging, with Camilla's extended family notably absent from the traditional gatherings. However, her immediate children, Tom and Laura, had attended after lengthy conversations about appropriate boundaries and expectations. Camilla entered the study carrying a letter that had arrived with the Morning Post. Her expression was thoughtful but no longer carried the raw pain that had characterized the weeks immediately following Charles's decision. "It's from Sarah," she said, referring to her niece whose wedding had sparked the original crisis. "She's written to thank us for the wedding gift, and to say that she understands why we couldn't attend." Charles looked up from his papers, surprised by this development. "That's very gracious of her." "She also mentions that Derek has closed his consulting business," Camilla continued, settling into her usual chair. Apparently, the publicity made it impossible for him to continue operating in the same way. The news gave Charles no satisfaction. He had never wanted to destroy anyone's livelihood, but Derek's decision to shut down his business suggested that the inappropriate use of royal connections had been more central to his operations than anyone had realized. "I hope he's able to find a more suitable way to earn a living," Charles said diplomatically. Camilla studied her husband's face, noting the genuine concern in his expression. Over the past months, she had come to understand that his decision, while painful, had not been made out of malice or personal dislike. The weight of his responsibilities as king had forced him to make choices that conflicted with his personal desires, and she could see that the burden of those choices continued to affect him. "I've been thinking about attending some events with the Duchy of Cornwall Foundation," she said, changing the subject to lighter matters. "Lady Pemberton has suggested that my presence might help with their upcoming fundraising campaign." Charles smiled, pleased to see Camilla engaging more actively with her royal duties. The months following his decision had been difficult for her as she adjusted to the new reality of her family's relationship with the monarchy. But, gradually, she had begun to refocus her energy on the causes and organizations where she could make a positive difference. The telephone rang, and Charles's private secretary announced that the Prime Minister was requesting an urgent audience. As Charles prepared to leave for the meeting, Camilla rose from her chair and approached him. "Charles," she said quietly, "I want you to know that I've come to understand something important over these past months." He paused in gathering his papers, giving her his full attention. "When I married you, I thought I understood what it meant to be married to the king," she continued. "But I was still thinking like someone who could put family loyalty above institutional responsibility. I've learned that being queen consort means accepting that sometimes the crown must come first, even when it breaks your heart." Charles felt a wave of emotion wash over him as he heard these words. The past months had tested their marriage in ways he had never anticipated, and there had been moments when he feared that his decision might ultimately cost him the woman he loved. "I've also learned something," he replied, moving closer to her. "I've learned that making difficult decisions is easier when you have someone who truly understands the weight of those decisions. Your support means everything to me, even when you disagree with my choices." They embraced briefly, a moment of connection that reaffirmed their commitment to each other despite the challenges they had faced. As Charles left for his meeting with the Prime Minister, Camilla returned to her correspondence, including several letters from charities seeking her patronage. Later that afternoon, Charles received a call from his eldest son William, who had been following the family situation with concern for both his father and stepmother. The Prince of Wales had initially been skeptical of the dramatic action, but recent events had convinced him of its necessity. "I wanted you to know that Catherine and I fully support the position you've taken," William said. "We've seen how difficult this has been for you and Camilla, but it was the right decision for the institution." Charles appreciated his son's support, particularly given William's own future as king and the precedent that this situation would set for his reign. The conversation also touched on recent polling data showing increased public confidence in the monarchy's commitment to ethical standards and accountability. As evening approached, Charles and Camilla attended a reception for military veterans, their first major public appearance together since the announcement. The event proceeded smoothly, with both of them demonstrating the practiced ease that came from decades of royal duties. Observers noted that while they appeared somewhat more formal with each other than in the past, their partnership remained strong and effective. The reception included several Commonwealth representatives who had worked with the royal family on various initiatives. During conversations with these diplomats and officials, it became clear that Charles's decision had actually enhanced the monarchy's reputation internationally, with many viewing it as evidence of strong leadership and commitment to institutional values. On the drive back to Clarence House, Camilla reflected on the evening's events. "I noticed that several people specifically mentioned their respect for your handling of recent challenges," she observed. "The institution is stronger when people trust that we uphold consistent standards," Charles replied. "That's what I tried to explain during our difficult conversations in October." "I understand that now," Camilla said. I wish it hadn't taken such a painful experience for me to fully grasp what you were trying to tell me. As their car passed through the gates of Clarence House, both Charles and Camilla felt a sense of resolution that had been absent for months. The crisis had tested their marriage, their individual commitments to duty, and their understanding of what it meant to serve the crown in the modern era. The lessons learned during this difficult period would influence their approach to royal duties for years to come. Charles had demonstrated that he was willing to make unpopular decisions when institutional integrity was at stake, while Camilla had shown her ability to adapt and grow in her role as queen consort. Their marriage had survived its greatest test, emerging perhaps not unchanged, but certainly stronger and more mature. The king and queen consort had learned to navigate the complex balance between personal relationships and public duty, a skill that would serve them well throughout the remainder of Charles's reign. As they prepared for bed that night, both reflected on how much they had learned about themselves, their marriage, and their roles within the monarchy. The painful decisions of the past year had clarified their priorities and strengthened their resolve to serve the British people with integrity and dignity, regardless of the personal cost.